Dispatchers aren't robots. Now, I know that sounds kind of obvious, but in public safety, we sometimes need to say the obvious out loud because we've gotten really good at pretending it's not true. A dispatcher can sound calm while someone else is screaming. They can keep typing while a caller is completely falling apart. They can deliver CPR instructions over the phone while managing radio traffic, updating CAD, and listening for background noise that's relevant, and still sound like they're sitting there ordering lunch. Now, that doesn't mean the call had no impact. It just means that they're trained professionally. Today on TiPS, I want to talk about dispatcher wellness, emotional permission, peer support, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, feeling something after a hard call doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human. And that's coming up next on TiPS, Today in Public Safety.
Welcome to TiPS, Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Here's your host, Fletch, with today's tips.
Welcome to TiPS, Today in Public Safety. This is Fletch. I'm an NINA certified EMP. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I bring you the latest, most informative, and sometimes a bit controversial takes on emergency communications. Today, I want to start a conversation about dispatcher wellness. And before anybody starts rolling your eyes and thinking, here we go, another wellness episode, let me say this right up front. This is not about putting a scented candle in the break room and pretending the culture has been fixed. It's not about a poster on the wall that says resilience in huge letters over a picture of a mountain. And it's definitely not about telling somebody who just handled a child CPR call, a domestic violence call, a suicide call, and a pursuit all in the same shift to just take a deep breath and try yoga. No, that's not wellness. That's just a greeting card with some liability issues, and we'll properly handle that on an upcoming episode. Stay tuned for that. But what I'm talking about here is much more basic than any of that. I'm talking about the human being under the headset. The person who takes the call, manages all the chaos, hears that panic, and absorbs the emotion, keeps the incident moving. And then when it's over, often has about 8 or 9 seconds before that next line starts ringing. That person is not a machine. And if we build our ECC culture around the idea that they are supposed to act like one, then we shouldn't be surprised when people eventually burn out, shut down, lash out, or even leave. Remain calm and dispatch. There's a phrase that public safety uses all the time, remain calm. And yeah, it is part of the job. Call takers have to remain calm. A dispatcher has to remain calm. They've got to have that steady voice in the middle of someone else's emergency. That's just one of the things that makes the work so difficult and so important. But somewhere along that way, I think we confused professional composure with emotional absence. You see, those are not the same thing. A dispatcher can remain calm and still be affected by what they've heard. They can perform beautifully during the call and still carry that call afterward. They can be the strongest person in the room and still need that support afterwards. It's not the headset that turns people into robots. The console doesn't erase the human emotion that's sitting behind it. And the ability to function during a crisis doesn't mean the crisis had no impact. No, it just means they did the job. And I think that's where this conversation gets important because dispatchers spend their careers being expected to keep moving. Bad call ends and the next call comes in. The radio doesn't care that your last caller was crying. CAD doesn't pause because your body is still processing what just happened. And the phone system doesn't gently whisper, take all the time that you need. No, it rings again and again. And when all that happens enough times, I think people start to normalize and carry things that they should probably be allowed to put down. I think one of the hardest parts of dispatch that I see is that most people outside the ECC don't really understand what happens inside that room. They think dispatchers just answer phones. They think dispatchers just send the police. They think dispatchers are glorified message takers. And you know what? It's technically true. Technically true in the same way that saying a surgeon just uses sharp objects is technically true. You see, it misses most of the point. Yeah, we all know dispatchers are often the first responders. They're the first voice of government services in a crisis. They're the ones that are there first trying to bring order to the chaos before anyone else even knows where they're going. They may be guiding CPR. They might be talking to a suicidal caller. They might be hearing a domestic violence assault start to unfold in real time. They may be catching the fact that the caller's location doesn't match the phone data. Ask me about that story. I'll tell you. And for those of you who know, you know that's a big deal. They may be hearing something in the background that just changes the entire safety picture for the responders. And then, after all of that, they probably will never know what actually happened. A thank you from the caller may actually exist, but they'll never get to hear it, so they may never get closure. They just get the next call. And I think that it's that kind of invisibility that creates the isolation. And isolation is a dangerous thing because the perception that people feel unseen makes it harder for them to admit when the work is starting to affect them. And that's why wellness can't just be something that we talk about after the major incident. It can't only be activated when the call makes the news or when everybody agrees that, yeah, that one was pretty much a shit show. Because sometimes the weight is not one giant event. Sometimes it's the accumulation of all of the events. And it takes the tone of one caller, the sound of one scream, the silence after a question, or maybe the child in the background or officer not answering the radio fast enough, or maybe that address that sounds familiar, a certain call that reminds you of another call, and the shift that never really let your nervous system stand down. And that's where the old public safety response of "suck it up, buttercup" starts to fail pretty badly. Because people can't keep doing the job while they're still struggling. That's part of the problem. Sure, people can show up for work, answer the phone, dispatch the units, clear the calls, and still not be okay. Sometimes struggling just doesn't look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like disengagement. Maybe someone stops participating, someone stops laughing, someone stops offering help. Someone comes in, works the shift, goes home, and emotionally disappears from the team. Other times it might look like anger or sarcasm that stops being funny, or that dark humor that we all have that stops being a pressure valve and starts becoming armor. Look, dark humor exists in public safety. We all know it, and sometimes it helps people get through the shift. Sometimes it's a genuinely funny thing in a closed circle, and sometimes it's the only thing standing between sanity and a full system reboot, but sometimes it gets old. Sometimes it's the thing that we hide behind because saying something real feels too risky. And that's where culture matters, because peer support doesn't begin with the form. It doesn't begin with a team activation. It doesn't begin with someone officially declaring that support is now available between 1400 and 1600 in Conference Room B. That's assuming nobody booked it for copier training. Now, peer support begins in the everyday way people treat each other. It begins when someone can say, "That call bothered me," and not be treated like they're weak. It begins when a coworker notices those quiet changes and asks, "Hey, you good?" but actually means it. It begins when a supervisor understands that checking on people is not separate from leadership. It is leadership. I think it begins when the room becomes a place where people can be professional without having to pretend that they're made of concrete. Now, I also think we've got to be careful about how we talk about wellness, because dispatchers can smell fake wellness from across the room, and a lot of you are smelling it right now. I'm not a wellness person, but I have enough wellness friends that are experts, and that's why I've got a very special episode coming up very shortly, but more on that later. I'm just here to remind you that if the advice doesn't fit the environment, it's not helpful. If a dispatcher working short-staffed on mandatory overtime who's eating dinner from a plastic container, all while trying to time a bathroom break between radio traffic, doesn't need some polished corporate wellness speech from someone who's never worked a midnight shift, holiday storms, staffing shortages, or a cat outage all at the same time. Now, wellness has to be realistic. It's got to fit the job. Sometimes that might mean stepping away for 2 minutes after a hard call. Sometimes it might mean breathing in a way that tells your body the immediate threat has now passed. Maybe it means stretching at the console or taking a walk around the room when the coverage allows it. It might be something as simple as talking to someone who understands the work without needing a 40-minute explanation. Or it might mean jumping jacks in the bathroom, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that public safety has built the entire operational workarounds out of worse ideas. The point is, not every tactic works for every person. The point is that the body has to be told that the stress cycle is complete, because in dispatch, the emergency may end up on the screen long before it ever ends up inside the person who handled it. Call gets closed, the unit's clear, the incident number is long filed, but the dispatcher's mind may still be carrying that sound, that urgency, that fear, or that adrenaline, and if that never gets addressed, it doesn't just vanish because the shift ended. I think it starts to pile up, and this is why wellness is not a side project. It's not soft, it's not optional, and it's not separate from operations. In fact, I'd argue it's probably one of the most important operational readiness issues that's out there. Because at the end of the day, people are the system. We can talk about CAD, radio, NG911, GIS, AI, cybersecurity, resiliency, redundancy, and every other technology that I love to diagram on a whiteboard. And trust me, all of that matters. But when the call comes in, it still lands on a human being under the headset. A human that's got to listen. A human that has to interpret. And a human that has to calm the caller. A human being that's got to recognize when the data doesn't match the situation, when they have to make sense of all the chaos. So if that human is exhausted, unsupported, isolated, overloaded, and quietly burning out, then the system is already under stress. And you're not going to see that on a dashboard. You're not going to get a red alarm. There may not be trouble tickets that get automatically generated saying dispatcher morale approaching critical threshold. Although with AI, you never know. Although honestly, if somebody wants to build that dashboard, please make sure it has a giant flashing button labeled "Stop Buying Pizza and Fix Staffing." But regardless, the stress is still there, and eventually it's going to show up. It'll show up in sick time, it'll show up in turnover, it'll show up in conflict, and it'll show up in mistakes. It'll show up in people leaving the profession, and sometimes, maybe even more sadly, it's going to show up in people staying in the profession but losing the part of themselves that used to love it. And that's the part that really should bother us. Because dispatchers don't need permission to be tough. They're already tough. They don't need permission to handle pressure. They do that every day. They don't need permission to care about the mission. They've proven that time and time again every time they sit in the chair. What they need permission is to be human. Permission to feel something after a hard call. Permission to say, hey, wow, that one really got me. And permission to take 5 minutes when 5 minutes are available. Permission to ask for support before they're broken. And permission to talk to a peer without being judged. Permission to care deeply about the work without pretending the work never affects them. That is not weakness. That is just honesty. And in public safety, honesty isn't a luxury. It's part of the survival. Reality check. Look, here's the reality check. If your ECC culture is only going to support people after they fall apart, then it's not really supporting them. It's waiting for visible damage. And that's a bad strategy. You don't have to wait for the radio system to completely fail before we care about maintenance. We don't need to wait for the CAD to burst in flames before we think about redundancy. We don't need to wait for the generator to start coughing smoke on its last breath during a hurricane before we wonder whether fuel and testing might have been a little more important. At least I hope we don't. So why do we sometimes treat people that way? Why do we wait until something is burned out, bitter, disengaged, or walking out the door before we ask what happened? No, dispatcher wellness has got to be built into the culture before the breaking point. Not as a slogan, not as a checkbox, not as a we sent everyone a link to an employee assistance program, so we're good. As an actual expectation that people can talk, supervisors can listen, coworkers can check on each other, and the organization can admit that this work has weight, because it does. And pretending otherwise doesn't make the weight disappear. It just makes people carry it alone. The bottom line. Look, dispatchers aren't robots. They're trained professionals that are skilled communicators, crisis managers, information processors, and often the first responders in the chain of survival. But at the end of the day, they are still people, and people need support. They need connections. They need permission to feel. They need leadership that understands wellness and that it's not a side conversation. It's part of the operational readiness. They need coworkers who can move beyond the joke when the moment calls for something real. They need a culture where asking for help isn't treated like failure, and they need an industry that recognizes the truth. You can't protect the public if you're quietly destroying the people who answer the call. So yeah, remain calm, do the job, be professional, manage the chaos, but when the call is over, let the human being under the headset exist too. Because feeling something does not mean you're weak. It just means the work matters, and so do you. And that wraps up today's episode of Tips Today in Public Safety. Thanks so much for listening. Stay tuned for a special guest coming up very shortly, where we're going to dive into this a lot deeper. This is Fletch. Remember to follow me on social media. Stay safe. Thanks so much for listening. And if you're in public safety, thanks for what you do every single day. We'll catch you next time. Hey, it's Fletch. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you learned something new. Remember to catch all of my previous episodes of Tips Today in Public Safety, published every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on most social media platforms and streaming 24/7 at 911tips.com. My blogs are located at fletch.tv, and my personal website is at fletch911.com. Remember to like and subscribe. It really helps out the algorithms. And if you're in public safety, thanks for what you do every single day. We'll catch you next time. Take care.
You've been listening to Tips Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Hosted by Fletch and available every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Catch past episodes on 911tips.com. Be sure to like and subscribe, and remember to join us each week for the latest on NG 911. I am Spider Harrison, the official 911 voiceover dude. Catch me on Sirius XM on various channels, including 90s on 9, the 10 spot, and on the Weekend Countdown on Hits 1. Or don't regret it for the rest of your life. Either way, I'm good.